Hey guys, welcome. TJ here with Dead History, and welcome to this next presidential series installment, our part 2, taking a look at the 36th President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson, good old LBJ. So I am flying solo here for the audio portion of this. As you all know, part 1, we took a look at the young life and the birthplace and childhood of LBJ, and his rise through the political ranks all the way to Vice President of the United States. And now in part 2, we are going to focus on his presidency, his legacy, of course his death, and then his burial and the burial site that LBJ is laid to rest at there in Texas on his ranch, on the LBJ ranch. So that'll be part 2. Of course, I'm going to go over kind of a synopsis and overview of his presidency with notes myself. And then, of course, we're going to read from the wonderful book, The President is Dead by Louis Picone, which we do every week regarding the death of LBJ. So, here we go. Jumping right in. Normally, as everyone knows, I usually start off with the election results based on that person becoming president in the election. However, as we all know, Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, was John F. Kennedy's vice president. So when Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd of 1963, LBJ then became the 36th president of the United States. So he did get reelected. We're going to go over that election, though, in a little bit. So we're not going to start with that. We're going to just jump right into a synopsis and overview of his presidency. Here we go. The next man to inherit the presidency would not miss an opportunity to leave his mark. I think it is almost impossible for us to imagine now what it must have been like for Lyndon Johnson on that November day in 1963 to suddenly find himself president under those circumstances, with a country that is traumatized and a world that is watching, needing to assert that we were going to be able to move forward. Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson insisted on being sworn into office on Air Force One just hours after Kennedy's assassination, with the president's widow by his side. The 55-year-old Texan would bring an overwhelming force of personality to the presidency. As the 36th President of the United States, LBJ was a force of nature. Any man or woman who he needed to help him in his quest for legislative success received what became known as the Johnson treatment. Hubert Humphrey, who would actually be Lyndon Johnson's vice president, said he came out of a meeting with Lyndon Johnson one time and he was covered with blood, tears, sweat, spit, and sperm. He would get close to you. He would get his arm around you. He would invade your space and he would sweet talk you. He would promise you things. He would get mad at you. But one thing was for sure. By the time he let you go, he had your vote. He had some leader he wanted to talk to one time. And that leader, the person was in Canada on a hunting trip. And he somehow talked some of the Canadian mounted police into putting up signs on trees. You know, please call. Johnson's sheer will to succeed had propelled him throughout his political career. But his domineering personality sometimes alienated those around him. And his behavior impressed some Americans and horrified others. One famous story is that he took a group of reporters out behind the ranch. He turned his back on them, he unzipped his pants, and he began to urinate on the ground. Finally, the president turns and says, "I always wanted said of me that he was the kind of man who was not afraid to piss on his own grave. Because it actually turns out that he had urinated on ground that he and Lady Bird Johnson had set aside for their burial plots. Funny stuff. Some people believed Johnson's coarse attitude was a reflection of insecurity. He was raised in poverty in the rural South. LBJ often felt like an outsider in Washington, but his experience resulted in an empathy for minorities and the poor that was unique among presidents.
We believe that all men are created equal, yet many are denied equal treatment. We believe that all men have certain unalienable rights, yet many Americans do not enjoy those rights. We believe that all men are entitled to the blessings of liberty, yet millions are being deprived of those blessings, not because of their own failures, but because of the color of their skin.
The death of John F. Kennedy provided the political momentum for Johnson to pick up the torch and put civil rights legislation front and center. We were not fulfilling our most basic promises as a nation, which is that all men are created equal. And until LBJ, you had no president who put that into effect legally. And LBJ comes in, and through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, he essentially fulfills the promise. Johnson was a much more adept manipulator of Congress. In the area of race relations and civil rights, I think Johnson was able to do things that Kennedy never would have been able to do. But he also recognized that the South, where the Democratic Party had held such sway, particularly since the Roosevelt days, that now that was going to change. As he signed the Civil Rights Act, LBJ remarked, "There goes the South for a generation." The president felt it was worth the sacrifice. But Johnson was not finished. He would also take on the poverty he had experienced firsthand growing up through legislation he termed his Great Society. The Great Society represents the most dramatic increase in federal power and the power of the presidency since the days of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. It is all these things that fundamentally change who we are as a nation. It is Medicare, it is Medicaid, it is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, it is the Arts and Humanities Act, Head Start, the first environmental legislation in America. Whatever you think of the Great Society, it is an interesting fact how little of it has actually been repealed. How much of it has become part of the fabric of the nation's life. In the midst of LBJ's Great Society initiatives, Republicans nominated Barry Goldwater, a hardline senator from Arizona, a man in stark contrast to the liberal Johnson. And Goldwater runs an unbelievably incompetent campaign. In the closing days, Lyndon Johnson is authorizing campaign expenditures in Arizona and Louisiana and Georgia. And why, you might ask? Not because the race is competitive at all, but because Johnson wants to carry more states than FDR had carried in 1936. Johnson ended up carrying 44 states, too short of FDR's record. But his victory did sweep in huge Democratic majorities to Congress. With a feeling of even greater authority, he turned his attentions overseas to South Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson does not want to go into the history books as a great wartime president. His domestic program is what he truly cares about. In fact, he calls the Great Society the woman I always loved as opposed to that bitch of a war, referring to Vietnam. He very much sees Vietnam as a necessary trade-off in order to keep the support that he wants and needs for his Great Society program. There was a pretty strong consensus as the war is escalating that this was absolutely necessary to halt the expansion of communism aggression in Asia and prevent the dominoes from falling. The irony of all of this is that Johnson, in 1964, campaigns as the peace candidate. He says in one of his most famous lines that he won't send American boys off to Asia to fight in a war for which Asian boys should be doing the fighting. But LBJ would not keep his word. Johnson used a minor naval confrontation with North Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin to get congressional approval for supporting anti-communist regimes in Southeast Asia. It provided legal justification for his eventual commitment of more than 500,000 U.S. ground troops in the region. After transformative domestic reform, the remainder of Johnson's presidency would be undermined by a grinding overseas war and a hugely divided country at home. November 2nd of 1965, in Washington, D.C., a 31-year-old Quaker named Norman Morrison stood outside of the Pentagon and set himself on fire. His public suicide was a protest against the Vietnam War and a harbinger of the anxiety growing across America. The people were beginning to turn against President Johnson's war, putting intense political pressure on the White House and placing executive power in the crosshairs. On any given day of Lyndon Johnson's presidency, you could hear protesters outside of the White House saying, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Johnson had campaigned on a promise to keep American troops out of Vietnam, but as American Air Force bases there continually fell under attack, it triggered a gradual escalation of American intervention that would soon become an intractable and unpopular war. Johnson initially dispatched 3,500 troops. By the end of his presidency, more than 500,000 were stationed across the Pacific. Lyndon Johnson is also inseparable from the birth of the credibility gap. The distinction between what the government was telling us about Vietnam and what was actually happening. It so damaged his own credibility and his own stature and standing, and it so damaged his presidency. January of 1968, the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, a massive coordinated attack on more than 100 towns and cities across South Vietnam and the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. The attack was ultimately repelled, but its scope undercut assurances coming out of the White House that the war was under control. Vietnam had turned against him. He really did not have a plan as to how to win it, get out, anything. How to deal with it. It was some great tragedy. Johnson, who had seemed invincible after a landslide victory in 1964, announced that he would not run for re-election. There's really two images that bookend the Johnson presidency in tragedy. One is that famous photograph of him being sworn in on Air Force One after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And the other one is him in anguish, head down on the cabinet room table. So there you go. That was kind of an overview of Johnson's presidency. I'm going to read some more about his presidency here for you. Lyndon B. Johnson was the 36th President of the United States. and he was sworn into office following the November 1963 assassination of President JFK. Upon taking office, Johnson, also known as LBJ, launched an ambitious slate of progressive reforms aimed at creating a great society for all Americans. Many of the programs he championed, Medicare, Head Start, the Voting Rights Act, and the Civil Rights Act, had a profound and lasting impact in health, education, and civil rights. Despite his impressive achievements, however, Johnson's legacy was marred by his failure to lead the nation out of the quagmire of the Vietnam War. He declined to run for a second term in office, and he retired to his Texas ranch in January of 1969. So just to read you a little bit about Great Society, soon after taking office, Johnson declared a war on poverty. He actively pushed Congress to pass legislation attacking illiteracy, unemployment, and racial discrimination. After routing Republican candidate Barry Goldwater by more than 15 million votes in the 1964 presidential election, Johnson introduced a slate of new reforms that he said would build a great society for all Americans. His ambitious legislative agenda created the Medicare and Medicaid programs to provide federal health insurance for elderly and poor Americans. It also included measures aimed at improving education, preventing crime, and reducing air and water pollution. Johnson also made great strides in attacking racial discrimination by signing the historic Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. His wide-reaching achievements improved the lives of millions of Americans and contributed to economic growth and prosperity. So yeah, LBJ definitely did some really great things, especially when you're dealing with, social issues, racial issues, racial discrimination, civil rights, and of course, medical health insurance, something that we're still fighting over in this country, 60 years later. It's one of those things that, Johnson believed that the government, federal government, should be able to help out those who are in poverty that need health coverage, and the elderly as well. So now a little bit more about Johnson and the Vietnam War. Despite Johnson's success in promoting his domestic reform policies, his presidency was also defined by the failure of his policies toward Vietnam. Like the three presidents before him, Johnson was determined to prevent North Vietnamese communists from taking over the U.S.-supported government of South Vietnam. A believer in the now discredited domino theory, Johnson worried that America's security depended on containing the spread of communism around the world. As part of his effort, Johnson steadily escalated U.S. military involvement in the Vietnam War. The number of American troops in Vietnam soared from 16,000 when he took office in 1963 to more than 500,000 in 1968, yet the conflict remained a bloody stalemate. As the war dragged on and American and Vietnamese casualties mounted, anti-war protests rocked college campuses and cities across the United States. Johnson's popularity within his own party plummeted as well. When it appeared that he might face a stiff challenge for the 1968 Democratic presidential nomination, Johnson announced his decision not to run for re-election. "I shall not seek, nor will I accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president," he said in a nationally televised speech on March 31st of 1968. Johnson explained that he wanted to focus on the peace process and pressing domestic issues during his final months in office without the distraction of a political campaign. The conflict in Vietnam, though, brought him nothing but pain and frustration until his last days in office, and U.S. military involvement in Vietnam continued for 4 years after his departure from Washington in January of 1969. So there you go, a little bit more touching on Johnson's presidency. So, this hits home hits close to home for me as far as the Vietnam War goes. My father, he was a Vietnam War veteran. My father was in the Army. He was drafted. There was a draft back then. My father was drafted, and he served time over in Vietnam. Obviously, he was one of the lucky men and women to return home, fortunately enough. Sadly, so many Americans lost their lives in the Vietnam War for really what turned out to be a pretty senseless involvement on our part, at least to the extent that we got involved, I should say. So, yeah. So, definitely, touches close to home for me and Henry. Henry's grandfather, my father, is a Vietnam vet, was a Vietnam vet. Father passed in February. Probably seeing a couple pictures of my father right now on the screen during his time there in Vietnam and such. So, in his military time. So, thank you to all veterans of all wars. It's something that here at Dead History we are huge supporters and proponents of, is our support for all veterans, all troops of our country, all military, all police, law enforcement, everything military personnel. We thank you so much for all you do for our country. And all of you men and women, we can't thank you enough. It's not enough that we only take about 1 or 2 days throughout the entire year nationally to recognize all of you brave men and women. So thank you very much from all of us here at Dead History. Now, moving on, just go over a couple fun facts like we always do about Johnson. We'll jump into a couple things here. So as I had said, the Johnson presidency was incredibly active. In addition to pursuing the Vietnam War, President Lyndon Johnson pressed on with an expansive slate of programs labeled as the Great Society that included 3 landmark civil rights bills and Medicare. But Vietnam's impact damaged Johnson's political base severely, and he declined to run for re-election in '68. Some more interesting things here. We know that. Here we go. Johnson, this is kind of cool. I thought this was interesting. Johnson is one of 4 people to hold 4 distinguished offices. Among the most trivial of trivia, be sure to memorize it for your pub quiz tonight, is Johnson's rare, strange distinction of the combination of offices held. Following John Tyler and Andrew Johnson, and followed by Richard Nixon, Johnson is one of only 4 people to have been a United States representative, the Senate Majority Leader, the Vice President, and the President of the United States. At age 44, Johnson also became the youngest person ever to serve as a Senate Minority Leader. Don't ever say we haven't helped you win your bar trivia. That's pretty cool, though. Only 4 guys in history. It's not exactly the most pleasant of company. It's a really cool distinction, don't get me wrong, holding the 4 distinguished offices, but the 3 other guys that Johnson is with are not exactly, world beaters. John Tyler, enough said, his accidency. Andrew Johnson, probably the most racist president we've ever had. And then Richard Nixon, the only president that ever resigned and had to resign due to scandal and corruption. Not exactly the greatest company, but cool nonetheless. Johnson voted against every civil rights bill in his first 20 years as a legislator. Lyndon Johnson's legacy is tied directly to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but he was an imperfect vessel for change. As a representative and senator, he'd voted down every civil rights proposal set before him, aligning with the post-Reconstruction South, calling President Truman's civil rights program a farce and a sham, an effort to set up a police state in the guise of liberty. Johnson changed his tune as a senator in 1957 and stridently coerced Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. the most sweeping civil rights expansion since Reconstruction as president. So there you go. He definitely changed his tune on that. Lyndon Johnson's style of coercion was called the treatment. At 6 feet 4 inches, Lyndon Johnson towered over most of his colleagues, and he used that physicality to his benefit. When he needed to extract a favor from someone, he'd simply stand over them with his face inches from their own and tell them just what he needed in a move dubbed the Johnson treatment. Beyond bodying his opponents and friends, Johnson would also promise to help them, remind them of times he'd helped them, coax, flatter, and predict doom and gloom for those who weren't on his side. His re-election in '64 was a true landslide. After the '87 vote debacle that launched him into the Senate early on in his political career, Johnson experienced a genuine electoral phenomenon befitting someone nicknamed landslide. In the 1964 campaign, Johnson faced not only Republican Barry Goldwater, but also questionable popularity. He'd never been elected president in his own right, and his leadership on the Civil Rights Act had Southern supporters questioning their loyalty. To counteract the latter development, Johnson deployed his greatest political ally, his wife Claudia Lady Bird Johnson, to tour the South in a train, passing out her pecan pie recipe alongside campaign buttons. After the final tally, Lyndon Johnson kept Texas and half the South, winning 44 states and 61.5% of votes cast, the largest ever share of the popular vote. There you have that. So I'm going to actually discuss that real quick with you. The 1964 election. We always like to go over when there's actually a re-election or something like that, of course. As I just touched on, Johnson went up against Republican Barry Goldwater from Arizona. The electoral vote count was Johnson 486, Barry Goldwater 52. States that were carried, Johnson carried 44 plus Washington, D.C. Goldwater only carried 6. Johnson's popular vote count was 43,127,041, and Goldwater's was 27,175,754. It was a percentage of 61.1% for Johnson to 38.5% for Goldwater. So yes, this was a true blue landslide. I mean, big time. So you're probably seeing, of course, the maps that I always show, the election result maps. You might even be seeing some LBJ campaign stuff. His running mate for vice president on that 64 Democratic ticket was Hubert Humphrey, the U.S. Senator from Minnesota. So that's a little tidbit for you. But yeah, it truly was a landslide. It wasn't even close. It wasn't even close to close. It was insanely one-sided. So, pretty interesting stuff. A couple more fun facts before we get into the death of Johnson. Johnson, of course, as we know, succeeded JFK to the presidency. John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd of '63. Johnson took over as the president, taking the oath of office on Air Force One. He finished the term and then ran again in '64, as we just touched on. His plans for a Great Society. Johnson called the package of programs he wanted to put through the Great Society. These programs were designed to help the poor and provide additional protections. They included Medicare and Medicaid programs, Environmental Protection Acts, Civil Rights Acts, and Consumer Protection Acts. His advances in civil rights. During Johnson's time in office, 3 major civil rights acts were passed. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made discrimination for employment illegal, along with the segregation of public facilities. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, literacy tests and other voter suppression actions were made illegal. And then the Civil Rights Act of 1968, where discrimination in terms of housing was made illegal. In 1964, the poll tax was outlawed with the passage of the 24th Amendment. And then, of course, we talked about strong-arming Congress. Johnson was known as a master politician. Once he became president, he initially found some difficulty in getting the acts he wanted to pass pushed through. However, he used his personal political power to persuade, and some would say strong-arm, many members of Congress to see things as he did. We already talked about the Vietnam War escalation. When Johnson became president, no official military action was being taken in Vietnam. However, as his terms progressed, more and more troops were sent to the region. By 1968, 550,000 American troops were embroiled in the Vietnam conflict. At home, Americans were divided over the war. As time went by, it became obvious that America was not going to win, due not only to the guerrilla fighting they faced, but also because America did not want to escalate the war further than it had to. When Johnson decided not to run for re-election in '68, he stated that he was going to try to get peace with the Vietnamese. However, this would not happen until Richard Nixon's presidency. And last little fun point, the vantage point. After retiring, Lyndon Johnson did not work in politics again. He spent some time writing his memoirs, The Vantage Point. This book provides a look at, and some say self-justification for, many of the actions he took while he was president. So there you go, kind of the presidency and legacy of our 36th president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, good old LBJ. And now it is time, yes indeed, ladies and gentlemen, for us to read from the wonderful book, The President is Dead by Louis Pacone. We read from this every week, and we're going to read about the death and then, of course, the burial site and gravesite of our 36th President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson. So, here we go. During the presidency of Lyndon Baines Johnson, an important tradition began. Every year, on a predecessor's birthday, a wreath of red, white, and blue flowers is sent by the White House and ceremoniously placed upon the former president's grave. In earlier years, this was done on occasion for the most venerated of our leaders. Of our leaders. With the first recorded official request made in January of 1924 for William McKinley. Over the years, the list grew to include 12 presidents, but thanks to Lyndon Johnson's expansion of the President's Approved Wreath List on August 11th of 1966, all of the presidents were henceforth remembered. This is especially meaningful for some of the lesser-known presidents, as it may be the only event of significance that occurs at the gravesite throughout the year. After deciding not to run for re-election in 1968, Lyndon Johnson spent the majority of his time where he felt most comfortable, on his ranch in Johnson City, Texas. The former leader of the free world would become restless and was notorious for directing his field hands with the same tenacity and sense of urgency with which he once commanded his cabinet. After his homestead became the Lyndon B. Johnson National Historic Park and the Presidential Library was opened in nearby Austin, he fretted over attendance, obsessing over how many people visited his library as compared to JFK's library in Boston. The affable Johnson was even known to pop into his namesake attractions to the delight of visitors. He also began to write a memoir, which by his time had become a post-presidential tradition, but he never finished it. In many ways, Johnson was a broken man, unable to deal with being out of power and haunted by the Vietnam War, which had tarnished his legacy. Historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, a former member of Johnson's staff who interviewed him extensively in his retirement years, recalled how he struggled. She found him to be a desolate man who almost willed himself to die. President Nixon believed Johnson's death was less physical than emotional when the day after he died, he told his staff, "I think President Johnson died of a broken heart. I really do. Here's Johnson, this big, strong, intelligent, tough guy, practically getting so emotional that he'd almost cry because his critics didn't appreciate him. He, till the very last, thought that he might be able to win them. And the point was, rather than have them love him, he should have tried to do what he could have done very well, have them respect him. And in the end, he lost. He neither gained the love nor retained the respect." Physically, Lyndon Johnson was also a wreck. He had a history of heart disease beginning in 1955 when he suffered his first heart attack on July 2nd. The episode prompted him to quit smoking, albeit temporarily. 17 years later, in April of 1972, he had another major heart attack. And only 3 months later, Johnson was back in the hospital with chest pains. Doctors considered open heart surgery, but it was not a viable option due to Johnson's extensive heart damage and complications from the bowel disorder diverticulitis from which he suffered. Due to the heart damage, doctors also ruled out bowel surgery. Johnson never expected to live long. His ancestors were not blessed with longevity, and this was one of the factors he considered when deciding not to seek re-election. 3 years after leaving office, he meticulously planned his funeral. He asked his good friend and spiritual advisor, Reverend Billy Graham, to officiate his graveside service and even advised him not to rely on notes because the wind could blow his papers away. And he was right. He knew that national dignitaries would descend upon his ranch, but Johnson also wanted his friends and neighbors to feel welcome at his funeral. He told his wife, Claudia Alta Taylor, Lady Bird Johnson, "When I die, I don't want just our friends who can come in their private planes. I want the men in their pickup trucks and the women whose slips hang down below their dresses to be welcome too." In January of 1973, Johnson's health was failing. After quitting smoking in 1955, he later resumed the bad habit and had become a chain smoker. In his final interview with Walter Cronkite on January 12th, he told the reporter that quitting would be bad for his heart as it would make him too nervous. His other vice was his favorite drink, Cuddy Stark whiskey. In an appearance in Austin on January 16th, onlookers noticed that Johnson looked thin. There was no major changes to his health, but Lady Bird noticed he was quieter than usual. His doctor had told him that the trip to Austin might prove fatal, but characteristically, Johnson had ignored the warning. Johnson was looking forward to a 6-week vacation in Acapulco, but the Secret Service was concerned. To be on the safe side, they made plans to have him covertly whisked out of Mexico if the worst happened. In an interview, Mike Howard, head of Johnson's Secret Service detail, bluntly stated, "In fact, I'd already made arrangements to sneak him out of there, in case he had an attack or in case he died. I had a plan to get him out, get the body out without the Mexicans knowing it, and get him back here so it would look like he died at home, because he didn't want, and we didn't want, any of that problem." On Monday, January 22nd, his family was out and Johnson ate lunch alone and took his afternoon nap. At 3:50 p.m., he suddenly experienced a sharp, severe pain. He grasped for the phone that connected him to the ranch switchboard operator, Bill Morrow, and frantically cried out, "Send Mike immediately." He was calling for Mike Howard, who was out driving on the ranch. Instead, Secret Service agents Ed Noland and Harry Harris rushed to his room. They arrived with oxygen in hand and found Johnson on the floor. He had vomited and was dark blue, and blood oozed out of a cut on his head from having fallen out of bed. Nolan tried mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. 4 minutes after Johnson's frantic call, Howard rushed in and began to administer an external heart massage. Despite his efforts, he admitted in a later interview he was already gone. Dr. David J. Abbott of Johnson City rushed to assist. At 4:19 p.m., Lyndon Johnson was carried onto a twin-engine Beach King airplane bound for San Antonio so he could be transported to the Brooke Army Medical Center. 70 miles away, Colonel George McGranahan from Brooke Army Medical Center rushed to the San Antonio airport to await their arrival. Aboard the plane with Johnson were pilot Barney Hewlett, Dr. Abbott, agents Nolan and Harris, and the wife of a ranch foreman, Jewel Malchek. During the 14-minute trip, Dr. Abbott desperately tried to revive Johnson. He pushed a tube down his throat and administered electric shock. After the plane landed, McGranahan examined the president. Lyndon Johnson was pronounced dead on arrival at 4:42 p.m. on January 22nd of 1973. Howard called Washington to report a Situation O, code for any president's death. Where Johnson actually died is vague. According to Howard, he was dead when he rushed into his bedroom, but was not pronounced until he reached San Antonio. And possibly, he could have died somewhere in the skies between. Harry S. Truman had passed away only 28 days earlier, and in accordance with Nixon's presidential order, federal flags were already being flown at half-mast for 30 days. This period was now extended to continue until 30 days after Johnson's death. Nixon went into office with 3 living former presidents, but after Johnson's death, none were left. The most recent time in our history this has occurred. No other president has had 3 of his predecessors die during his term. With no other members of the President's Club left, Nixon was without advice from the select few people in the world who understood what being President of the United States is really like. An ambulance then took Lyndon Johnson's body to Brooke Army Medical Center, where an autopsy was performed by Colonel L.R. Higer, Chief of Pathology. The cause of death was listed as coronary thrombosis, and Higer found 2 of 3 major arteries supplying the heart were completely occluded, and the 3rd artery was 60% occluded. While others have died at a younger age than Johnson, their deaths were attributed to assassination or a specific disease. Excluding those situations, Johnson became the youngest president to die. Johnson's remains were taken to the Army morgue at Fort Sam Houston and later transferred to the Weed Corley Funeral Home in Austin, Texas, where they arrived at 11:43 p.m. The next morning, on Tuesday, January 23rd, the silver flag-draped coffin was escorted to the Lyndon Baines Johnson Presidential Library Museum and placed at the top of the steps in the Great Hall. People flowed past, and while a band played, "The Eyes of Texas Are Upon You." This was more personal than most other presidential viewings, as family members shook hands and thanked people for coming. So, there you go. Obviously, there was then a viewing. Johnson's body was flown to Washington, D.C. in the same Air Force One that had carried John F. Kennedy's corpse almost a decade earlier. The remains were received at the airport and carried in a horse-drawn casket to the Capitol. Following the caisson was the horse Blackjack, the riderless and symbolic of the fallen military leader. The coffin was placed beneath the rotunda. Of course, there was, a viewing for the public there in Washington. And then eventually, after the crowd had dispersed and such, the Saturday after the funeral, 3,000 people visited the grave. The next day, that number increased to 4,000. So basically, hold on, I'm just looking here just so I can go back. Oh, here it is. After the Capitol viewing in Washington, the remains were escorted to Andrews Air Force Base and several hours later arrived at Bergstrom Air Force Base in Austin, Texas. And then they drove to the ranch where Johnson was buried. And on January 17th of 1974, 5 days before the first anniversary of Johnson's death, the grave was marked with a simple pink granite stone, and it read, Lyndon Baines Johnson, August 27th of 1908 to January 22nd of 1973, the 36th President of the United States of America. So, there you go. That's the death of Lyndon Baines Johnson. I will quickly read to you the death sites and such real quick here for you. So, the death sites, the official location of death is the San Antonio International Airport. Is the official, there's no marker at the airport to commemorate Johnson's death, and officials did not respond to any request to see the exact location where he was pronounced dead. But the airport is located at 9800 Airport Boulevard in San Antonio, Texas. Now, the funeral, the National City Christian Church was designed, let me see here. That is actually, so the National City Christian Church is located at 5 Thomas Circle Northwest in Washington, D.C. That's where the Johnson funeral was actually held. The National City Christian Church is where the funeral in Washington was held. And then, of course, the gravesite. The grave is the Johnson Family Cemetery. It's located in the wide-open Texas Hill Country in sight of Johnson's birthplace and down the road from his Texas White House. Johnson would visit the family cemetery often, and he always knew this was where he wanted to be buried. In 1966, he told some visitors, "I walk here nearly every morning. All these beautiful trees, so peaceful and quiet. I'm going to be buried there right next to my mother." He also liked to end his day with a stroll to the cemetery, once stating, "I come down here almost every evening when I'm at home." So, pretty interesting stuff. Obviously, that's right there on the Johnson Ranch, or the Lyndon Johnson. It's a national historic location. It's really cool, nice place. I enjoyed it. I was there last year, obviously, in 2020 during the pandemic. It's there in Johnson City, Texas. Now, when I went, none of the buildings and none of the interpretive centers and stuff were open. Just the grounds. You could drive through the grounds of the ranch. Now, stupidly, I don't know why I did this, foolishly, I went to the cemetery, so I obviously saw Johnson's grave, which you're seeing pictures of now, I'm sure. However, I didn't go over, which is right there, it's right on the grounds, to see the building of his birthplace. I don't know why, I just wasn't thinking, but anyway, I was there. It is a cool place. Big, huge. The Ponderosa, the big ranch. Very cool. And as you can see from some of these pictures of these steer and these cattle, it is a working ranch still. There are still livestock and animals on the ranch. So, and they just roam. They have no, they have carte blanche. They can roam anywhere. As you see, they were like right in the roadway and right next to the road. So, pretty cool. Very Texas-like, deep in the heart of Texas there. So, cool stuff. I'll definitely get back there because my brother and his family live right outside of Austin, Texas. So, I'll definitely get back there one day and go see his birthplace and such and his library. And I look forward to it. So, there you go. That was a look at the life, legacy, death, and burial, and of course the presidency of our 36th President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Good old LBJ. So I hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for next week. Of course, we're going to be taking a look at the 37th President of the United States, Richard Nixon. So stay tuned for that. We're getting down to the nitty-gritty here, folks. Only a few left in our presidential series. There might be one or two things of bonus footage, so stay tuned for some LBJ bonus footage. But, again, I hope you enjoyed this, and we thank you so much for all the support, me and Henry. We really appreciate you guys so much, and we thank you so much for taking the time out to watch these. I know sometimes these videos are a little longer, but we hope they're entertaining, and we hope they're somewhat informative and educational, too. It does take us quite some time to put these together each week, so we love seeing our hard work pay off when you guys enjoy it. So thanks so much. All right, guys, thanks. Stay well, stay safe. It's summertime, stay cool, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, guys. Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here with Dead History, and that behind me is actually Holly Bush Mansion, and you'll see, yep, right there, that little marker here, this plaque, and then there's one behind it too, over this way, yeah, right over there somewhere. I'm gonna flip you guys around and tell you all about it. Okay, so this is Holly Bush Mansion. We're actually on the grounds of Rowan University in Glassboro, New Jersey. And this was actually the meeting site of Soviet Premier Kosygin, I believe it is, and Alexei Kosygin, and President Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ. They actually met here in June of 1967, and they met here at the Holly Bush Mansion here. So I came down here to just kind of see this, and I've never been, so thought it'd be kind of cool. As you see, it says it right there. Holly Bush is best known as the site of the 1967 global meeting between President Lyndon Johnson and Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin, leader of the Cold War superpowers. So pretty cool stuff. Let me see if I'm sure it's not open, but look at this beautiful stained glass. Yeah, it's not open, but pretty cool though. Pretty cool looking old place. That's for sure. So cool stuff. Let's see, maybe walk around the ground here. It's beautiful, nicely kept. Beautiful place. It's a nice day. We had a tropical storm roll through New Jersey overnight, but it's turned out to be a beautiful day. And yeah, it's a beautiful old mansion, very nicely kept. There's the sign down there. It says Holly Bush Mansion right there. So there you go. Holly Bush Mansion, the site of the meeting between LBJ and Soviet Premier Kosygin, or Kosygin. So there you go. Just wanted to show you guys. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you enjoyed LBJ. Thank you guys so very much. I appreciate it. All right, bye-bye, guys.